Okay, so hopefully you can all see that slide, growing your green strategy. I get a thumbs up? Yeah, got in there. Thanks, Mark. Okay, I'm just juggling this. I'll do the introduction and admit people into the session at the same time. So if I take random pauses, then you know why. But yeah, thanks for coming along today. So my name is Hugh Williams, as I'm sure we've either spoken before or been interacting over email. So you probably know at least of me. And I am the business navigator for the Green Agenda for Swindon and Wiltshire Local Enterprise Partnership. And my role sits within the Growth Hub at the LEP. So my day-to-day is supporting businesses in Swindon and Wiltshire and encouraging them to put in plans to build out a carbon reduction plan, measure their carbon footprint, and also to signpost the services that are actually going to help them do this. So the way we do this is largely through one-to-one sessions and now through these workshops as well. So this is a relatively new thing. Ran the first one a couple of months ago, and it's backed by popular demand, I guess. And yeah, it does what it says on the tin. It's a workshop that's designed to help you develop a green strategy for your business. And we're going to cover carbon literacy and carbon footprint measurement in the first session. And then the development of strategy to reduce your carbon footprint and the support that's available to you is going to come after a short sort of 15-minute break after the session that's run for an hour and a half. So probably, for 3 hours. So probably after an hour and a half, we'll have that break. Yeah, so we'll look at those two things after the break. My slides to work. There we go. Okay, so looking at the first session, so like I said, this is going to be sort of an introduction, a bit of carbon literacy and carbon footprint measurement. So there are a few things that we're sort of setting out to achieve initially. And the first of those is just building out, like I said, that carbon literacy. So getting you familiar with some of the key terms that are out there within green strategy, which you need to be able to differentiate between when you're developing your carbon reduction plan, and if you're going to be able to accurately describe it to stakeholders. We want to be able to understand why it's so important to measure our emissions, and we're going to go through the different scopes of emissions as well, because you have to measure each of these, and the emissions within each of them combined is your carbon footprint. So we're going to go over an introduction to those and understand what you have to measure and also how you can measure it. So I'm going to give you a calculation tool that you can use there as well to actually get an understanding of what your carbon footprint is. And we're also going to give you an idea of how to present your emissions measurements and how you can report on them once you've actually got that initial measurement as well. So that's what we're hoping to get out of the first part of today's session, and hopefully we're going to manage it if my time management is good enough. But to kick us off, we're going to have a little breakout room just to get everyone talking a little bit and discussing sustainability and environmental strategy. And I'm going to split you into breakout rooms in a second, and it'll be good if you could just have a chat for sort of 10-15 minutes about an introduction to yourselves and your business, what you're hoping to get out of the session, what sustainable actions you're already taking as a company, so what you've already got in place. And also areas of environmental sustainability that you're considering for the future or that you'd like to improve on. And hopefully this is just a nice way to start talking about what you're considering and actually hear from other people about what they're thinking. And then you can actually think, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Maybe I should be thinking about that as well. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen to put you into your breakout room. Okay, hopefully that's back up and running and you can see the slides again. Hayley, I've got you on camera, so can you give me a thumbs up if you can see it? Thanks. I can't choose who's on camera, it just assigns it randomly. It's odd. Okay, yeah, so hopefully you found that just a useful exercise just to get yourself thinking about sustainability, as Rob would say, on a Tuesday morning, but even better on a Wednesday morning. So we'll get stuck into the nitty-gritty of it a little bit now. And we're going to start the emissions workshop by looking at emissions measurement. And you might be wondering, why is this the first thing that we're going to talk about? Well, I think really it's the only first step that you can take within your green strategy. And you might think that the best first step is just to start turning off the lights more often or giving everyone reusable water bottles, but it's not. And taking these incremental sort of steps is a really good thing to do, but it doesn't give you an idea where you are in terms of the whole picture of what you're doing as a company with regards to your emissions footprint. And this means that without measurement, while you can take small actions, there are likely going to be far more significant contributors to your emissions, which you're going to overlook and undermine all those sort of small actions that you're taking as a business. And as the first bullet point says, you can't improve on what you don't know. So it's crucial, if you want to be greener, then you measure your emissions to see where they are actually coming from. And then once you've measured and identified your biggest emissions contributors, you can then plan a targeted strategy on how to lower those. So without measurement, you'd sort of be shooting in the dark with your strategy. So you wouldn't know if you're making significant contributions to actually lowering your emissions or not. And another reason that measurement is so important, and it's at the top of our agenda today, is that you can't make claims about how successful your emissions cuts have been if you're not measuring them. So if you take the example, we've cut our carbon emissions by 50% since 2019. That's a great claim, and it's one that might win you business and is definitely going to improve your reputation. But if you're not measuring your carbon footprint, you won't know what your carbon footprint was in 2019, and you won't know if you've halved it since then. So it's these sort of claims about how much you've lowered your emissions that your customers and your suppliers and your staff are going to love. And it means it's worth measuring your emissions just to be able to make those sort of statements about how your business is doing with its green targets. So that is why this is at the top of the agenda today. And before we get into the real business of measuring your carbon footprint, I just want to make sure everyone is familiar with a few key terms that you've got to understand when you're looking at what your carbon footprint is. And it's better to get these right now rather than to have a poor understanding of them going forward and having questions down the line. So if you are familiar with them already, I'm sorry, and just make yourself a cup of tea for the next sort of 5 minutes. But hopefully it's a good refresher as well, actually. So the first term here is emissions scopes. And scopes of emissions is just another fancy term for categories of emissions. And there are 3 scopes or categories, which we'll look at in a bit more detail later, but which are quite unoriginally called Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. And it's good to be familiar just with the concept of these scopes at the moment, as when you're reporting your carbon footprint, you've got to break it down into each of those 3 and understand what's going on within each of them. So next up, we've got carbon reporting, and this is another term that's on here. So your carbon report is a published document, it's an externally published document that shows your carbon footprint, what it is numerically, broken down into the 3 scopes. And then as well as the numerical side, you'll go into a bit of detail about the steps you're taking to lower your emissions. So it's a good idea of where you are now, shown through the numbers, and then where you're going in the future and the steps that you're taking, shown in a bit more written detail. Your base year is a term you might be familiar with already, especially if you're sort of overseeing the financial reporting for your business, but it's also crucial to carbon reporting. And here it means the year against which carbon emissions from the current year are compared against. So if your base year is 2019, and in 2022, you're saying you've reduced your carbon emissions by 50%, then that reduction is a reduction of 50% compared to your 2019 levels, as that's your base year. So it's needed as a point of reference going forward for your carbon measurement. What have we got next? CO2 equivalent, or CO2e, and this is a really important term because it's the unit that your carbon footprint is reported in. So basically, CO2 isn't the only greenhouse gas out there. It's certainly the most popular in terms of the focus that it's given. But when we're talking about greenhouse gases, we also have to take into account methane, nitrous oxides, other gases like that. So, so we can view all of our emissions through one number. CO2e, CO2 equivalent, was created, and this basically allows us to look at the different greenhouse gases all within one common unit and within one number, so that we have one figure that encompasses the amount of CO2, methane, nitrous oxides, and all other greenhouse gases that we're producing. And then when you've measured all of your emissions, your overall carbon footprint is going to be in X tons or X kilos of CO2e. So that's a really important one to understand there. Our next term is carbon neutral, and this is where you achieve neutrality in your emissions, unsurprisingly. So for every kilo or ton of CO2 or other greenhouse gases that you're putting into the atmosphere, you're taking the same amount out of the atmosphere. So with carbon neutrality, it's important you realise that your emissions could still be really high, but you're just compensating for them. So your emissions could be 10,000 tons of CO2e, but you're taking steps to actually take the same amount out of the atmosphere. So you are still damaging the environment, but you're mitigating it through taking the same amount out of the atmosphere. And in terms of how you compensate for your emissions when you're carbon neutral, you use a process called carbon offsetting, which is the next term here. And this is essentially a reduction in emissions in the atmosphere to compensate for emissions being created by you elsewhere. So it's this that allows companies to take emissions out of the atmosphere and to ultimately claim that they're carbon neutral. The classic example, and the one I'm sure you're all familiar with, is tree planting. But there are loads of other projects like peatland restoration, planting coastal vegetation, or other projects that avoid carbon emissions being put into the atmosphere in the first place, like protecting an area of woodland. All of those count as offsetting, but tree planting is the most well known. We'll come on to offsetting in a bit more detail later, but again, for now, it's good to understand the term. Carbon negative. So to be carbon negative, you've got to go beyond neutrality in your emissions. So for every kilo or ton of CO2 that you're putting into the atmosphere, you're taking more out of the atmosphere through carbon offsetting. Again, here though, it's important to realise you could still have a massive carbon footprint, but you are offsetting it effectively. And then next up, we have net zero. And this is probably the most important term on this slide. And it's an advancement on carbon neutrality and on carbon negativity. And net zero is reached when an organisation lowers its emissions to the lowest possible extent. So the remaining emissions are then offset. So this should be the ultimate goal of your green strategies, rather than carbon neutrality or carbon negativity, because if we're going to avoid the worst outcomes of climate change, we've got to reduce our emissions. And this is the only situation that really puts a massive emphasis on emissions reduction. Carbon neutrality and carbon negativity don't really do that. And there's a lot of confusion between carbon neutral and net zero, and often the terms are used interchangeably. But hopefully this sheds some light on the difference between the two and the idea that net zero is superior to carbon neutral as a stage of business. And then finally, we've got greenwashing. So this is where your business makes claims about its green credentials without sufficient evidence to back those up. So you might say we are the greenest thermos company in the UK. But if you can't back that up with emissions data, then it's unfounded, and that claim is going to be considered to be greenwashing. So greenwashing then also encompasses sort of diversionary tactics, so where you want to be perceived as an eco-friendly company. So you highlight one part of your business in the hope of diverting attention away from another part of your business, which is perhaps less green. So carbon neutral businesses are often accused of this because they do quite a lot of carbon offsetting, obviously, so they will point to the good that they're doing through planting trees and the impact that's having on the environment. And they will normally do that to detract from the attention that the more polluting aspects of their business are having. And if you do that, it very much looks like you're covering up elements of what part of your business is doing. So you run the risk of being accused of greenwashing. And that's another term we're going to come on to later. And I'm going to give you some tips on how to avoid being called a greenwasher, because it's damaging for brand reputation and it's not nice. So we'll come on to that later. But for now, I'm just going to take a quick pause and ask if there are any questions about the first part of the presentation, so clarification of those terms, or anything else regarding sort of emissions measurement before we get into next, which is the scopes of emissions and what you have to measure to understand there. So if anyone's got any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them now, or you can put them in the chat and I can take a look at them there as well. Silence. I love it. Okay. I will crack on to the next slide. Yeah, okay, so we're going to take a look at the different scopes of emissions here. And as we've been through, you've got scopes 1, scope 2, and scope 3, and we're just going to go into a bit more detail on each of them. And I thought it made sense to go in numerical order. So we'll start with scope number 1. And scope 1 emissions and emissions that are associated with scope 1 are essentially greenhouse gas emissions that occur from sources that are controlled or owned by your organisation. So you note that I say owned or controlled here, because obviously you might not own the equipment that creates the emissions. You might rent them as part of a lease agreement for your premises. But as long as it's you who's getting the benefit of this equipment and it's you who are controlling how it's used, it counts as your scope 1 emissions. So that's why we say owned or controlled. Anyway, you can think of your scope 1 emissions as coming from 3 sources. So you've got stationary combustion, which is the fuel consumption at your facility to produce normally heat. So here we're really looking at your gas boilers and your diesel generators that are heating your offices. We've got mobile combustion, and this is the combustion of fossil fuels in vehicles. Again, so now we're talking about vehicles that are owned or controlled by your company, so company cars really, or if you've got a delivery fleet that you own and run, then this would come under mobile combustion as well. And then lastly, we're also looking at refrigerants. So refrigerants used in your air conditioning systems, really. And they, again, come into what you have to understand to know your carbon footprint associated with scope 1 emissions. And you might be thinking that is all very well, but what data do I actually need to calculate emissions in each of those? Well, for your stationary combustion, so for the fuel that you're burning for your boilers or your diesel generators, you really want to understand the type of fuel that you're using for those generators, how much of it you're using, and also you're going to obviously need a unit for that measurement. Is it litres? Is it kilos? How's that working? For mobile combustion, it's similar. You're going to need to know the type of fuel used for each vehicle, and you're also going to need the distance travelled for each vehicle as well. And then obviously if you've got a range of different types of vehicle, then that might come into it as well. So if you've got electric powered vehicles and petrol or diesel operated vehicles, then there's going to be a change there too. And then lastly, in terms of refrigerants, you need to know the type of refrigerant used, because the more modern refrigerants are much less polluting than the older refrigerants. And you're going to need to know your refrigerant inventory at the start of the year and at the end of the year as well, so you can tell how much you've used over that time frame. And in a few slides time, we'll show you what to do with this data and how you can convert it into CO2 equivalent figures, which you need to have to calculate your carbon footprint. But at the moment, it's just useful to know what data you need to collect to measure this, because a good process to go through at this stage is to start thinking, okay, I know I need that data. How do I find it? Who do I need to get in contact with to actually pull the data that I need then to measure my Scope 1 emissions? And if we go back to our net zero ambition quickly, so if you want to be net zero in your Scope 1 emissions, you need to get a 100% reduction of them compared to your base year. And that sounds hard, to reduce your Scope 1 emissions by 100%, and it is going to be hard. But it's important to remember that to be net zero, you have a long time to get to that target. So most net zero targets are either 2030, 2040 or 2050. People seem to like setting targets for the end of decades. And the technology is obviously going to improve along this time. It's going to allow you to reach these targets. So for now, it's just about getting it as low as you can. And then when the technology comes in, that will, again, help you go forward there. Right, next up, we've got Scope 2 emissions. And these are emissions that are associated with your purchase of electricity and then also steam, heat or cooling. For most businesses, it's largely going to be purchased electricity, but you've also got to consider the other elements if you're buying from a combined heat and power plant. So if you purchase heat or steam that way, you have to consider those elements as well. Otherwise, electricity is the main element for consideration here. And the data that you'll need to know for Scope 2 is how much electricity you've purchased and the unit of measurement for that, which is usually going to be in kilowatts or kilowatt hours. The tricky part of Scope 2 is that when you actually put the data into your carbon emissions report, you're expected to report on those emissions in two different ways. So you're expected to report on it from a location-based and a market-based perspective. So location-based is the idea that to figure out how many emissions we assign to our electricity usage, we use data from the national grid of the primary country of the business, so the UK for all of you. And so this assumes that all electricity created in the UK requires the same amount of carbon emissions to produce it, no matter what electricity provider it's coming from, which obviously isn't strictly true. However, so market-based emissions come in then because they don't use grid data. So instead, you figure out how many emissions your electricity usage is causing by using data from your specific energy provider. And this recognises that not all electricity created in the UK requires the same amount of carbon emissions to produce it. And actually, it's going to depend on the provider the electricity is coming from and the tariff that you're on and elements like that. And this is a better, more well-rounded approach, as it gives a more accurate description of our actual emissions. And also it means if you're reporting to a market-based perspective, if you switch to a green tariff or a renewable energy provider, then this market-based approach is going to highlight the benefits of lowering the emissions in this move to your business. So it's a good one to draw out those as well. So how should you report on Scope 2 out of location and market-based? Well, I would say that most companies try and do both. And with market-based, it all depends on whether your supplier offers that information on the emissions caused by their electricity production, because some of them don't. And if they don't, obviously you can't get the data you need to report on your Scope 2 emissions from a market-based perspective. So in that instance, focus on location-based and maybe start having conversations with your electricity provider about when you might be able to get that market-based data. And then finally, going back to our net zero goal, again, as with Scope 1, to be net zero in our Scope 2 emissions, you're going to have to reduce them by 100% compared to your base year. And I think I've sort of alluded to it in the last slide as well, but a good piece of advice for a first step when thinking about measuring your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions is to figure out who has the data you need. So for the electricity, it's obviously going to be your energy provider. And then figuring out the same for Scope 1, is it going to be your office manager, your premises manager? How's that going to work, and who can actually get you access to the data that you need? Okay, scope 3. And this is where it can get a little bit messy because broadly speaking, scopes 1 and 2 are easier to calculate and to lower emissions in because they're a bit more limited in their description, but scope 3 is quite a lot broader. And scope 3 is the emissions which are the result of activities from assets that aren't owned or controlled by your organisation, but that your organisation indirectly creates just through its existence. So that means for your company, when you're measuring your scope 3, you have to consider emissions in your entire value chain. So both before you've made your product and after you've sold it on as well. And also the products that you use as a business. And there are masses of emission sources that are wrapped up within scope 3. So there are 15 categories within scope 3 overall. And these include emissions from purchased goods, capital goods, upstream and downstream distribution of goods, the waste you generate as a business, the use of the sold products, the disposal of goods. I think that's 6 or 7 of them. I won't rattle off all 15, but there's obviously guidance out there about each of the 15 categories. So it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with all of those as well. So the sheer number of categories here is something I think that deters a lot of businesses from, also someone's sent the way to me, there we go, is something that deters a lot of businesses from getting ready to measure their emissions, because companies get worried that they're not going to be able to find the data in all of these categories to fully measure their scope 3 emissions. But I think it's important to remember here that you are not expected to measure all of these emissions immediately, and that some of them you don't even have to measure at all. And this is because you're only expected to measure what's important to your business. So, for example, if you're a service-based company, there won't be any, or there'll be very few emissions associated with the end-of-life treatment of products. But there is going to be emissions associated for your business with travel and commuting. So you have to measure that as part of your scope 3 emissions. So a good first step is to look at the 15 categories of scope 3 and figure out what is going to be important to your business, and then start with those ones. I think it's also worth saying with scope 3 measurement that you don't have to measure everything which is important to your business at once. So start with what you know, because you might have a really clear idea of emissions from commuting. You might have already done a piece of work to understand emissions associated with your employee commute. So you can start by measuring that, and then you can move on to other factors. So really scope 3 needs to be thought of as this picture that gets built out over time, and you start with what you know, and then gradually you fill out that picture. And actually it's important that you don't bite off more than you can chew. You need to understand your capabilities as a business and what you can achieve with the resources that you've got. So do you have the staff and the time to really do a full understanding of your scope 3 emissions, or should you start smaller and then get to grips with that and then move on? Obviously, as there are lots of groups within scope 3, the data that you need to collect for each one of these 15 groups is going to vary massively, and there are a few examples that I've put on the slide here. So one of the more straightforward ones is travel. So you've got business travel and commuting that are wrapped up in that. And again, here you need to understand things like the type of vehicle and the distance it's traveling. And then from that, you can figure out the carbon output. But obviously, that's going to vary a lot, the data that you need, depending on which of the specific types of scope 3 emissions we're looking at. So I think just to round off the piece about scope 3, I think, yes, it can be intimidating, and lowering your emissions here is going to be quite hard, especially if you've got a complex supply chain where your suppliers sort of contracts out the work you ask them to do as well, or if it's hard getting visibility along that supply chain. And this complexity is something that's understood by net zero verification bodies and carbon measurement bodies. So unlike with your scope 1 and 2 emissions, when you're trying to be net zero, you have to reach 100% reduction in your emissions. With scope 3, you should be aiming for around a 90% reduction compared to your base year. And then once you've reduced it by roughly 90%, then that's the point you can actually claim to be net zero. They don't expect you to reduce it by 100% because I think there's an understanding if you do that, you're not going to be able to continue to operate as a business. So that there's that little bit of leniency there with regards to net zero and scope 3. We're just going to look quickly here at what happens if you're trying to measure your emissions and you are renting your premises, which I'm assuming is probably going to be true of quite a few people on this call. And I just wanted to look at this because it's a common objection to measuring emissions that you hear a lot of companies saying. So they sort of say, I'd love to reduce my emissions, but I rent my offices and my landlord doesn't want me to make any changes, so there's actually very little I can do. And it's a common problem, and it comes about because many businesses are concerned about the fact that they don't have any power to change things like aircon units or electricity provider, which obviously makes up a big proportion of your scope 1 and 2 emissions. So these businesses look at that and think, I don't think lowering my carbon footprint is particularly feasible at this time because I'm not allowed to make those changes. So I think it's important to understand that even if you rent, you do have options to lower your emissions. So for instance, with your scope 2, so your emissions from your electricity, you could stay with the same supplier that your landlord has chosen, but you could have a conversation about actually moving to a different tariff with that same provider. And if you can move to a green tariff, then obviously that's going to bring your emissions down as well. And then similarly, you can meet your green goals while you're renting if you talk to your landlord and let them know what you're planning in terms of carbon reduction. Or you could even come together with other companies who also rent the premises. And that's just going to help you communicate with your landlord and put together a proposal so they can understand where you're coming from. I just think the key word here is really communication. So making the owner of the premises understand what you want and what you're after. And then obviously if there's a good relationship there, then that can actually help you work towards your net zero targets. So essentially what I'm saying is that if you rent your office, this is not an excuse to not measure your carbon footprint. So don't think of it as one. You should measure it. You should figure out what it is. And then you should start figuring out how you can lower it. And just remember that your carbon footprint isn't going to improve if you don't measure it. So even if you rent, the best thing you can do for your green strategy is to get that initial measurement done. And it's also worth noting that in terms of how you actually measure and report those emissions if you're a renter, that it's pretty much the same as what we've looked at so far. So the scopes of emissions don't change if you rent or own your buildings. So there's no added complexity there, which is nice. Right, we're getting towards a break, which is good because my voice is starting to feel it a little bit. But I just want to bring your attention to a tool that can help you measure your carbon footprint. And I'll say at this stage as well, and I'll go into it in more detail later, but there is support out there as well that companies that can help you measure your carbon footprint, and which is also a great tool to use for businesses starting on this journey. But I thought I'd share this tool with you because it's free, it's Excel based, and it's relatively straightforward to use. So the tool is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Emissions Calculator, which I will share with you after this call in an email. But like I said, there are other tools out there which serve the same purpose. But because this one is free and something that you can do by yourself rather than bringing a partner organization, I thought I'd share it with you just because it's a good example of something you can use quite quickly to understand what your carbon footprint is. It's especially useful across scopes 1 and 2, I'd say as well. So once I've sent it over, I think my recommendation is to sort of open it, play around with it, put in data and see if you can figure it out, because it's fairly intuitive once you can get to grips with it. And then if you've got any questions, please feel free to drop me an email. But I've put together a little screenshot of the greenhouse gas protocols calculator so you can get a clearer idea of what it's going to offer you. So what you can see here are scope 2 emissions that are associated with purchased electricity, like it says in the third column. And you can see here that I've discovered that I've used 100 kilowatt hours of energy, and that's the data that I put in the first 2 columns. And then the tool has automatically converted that data into how many tons of CO2 equivalent the creation of that electricity is causing. So my electricity usage here is causing 0.0017 tons or 1.7 kilos of CO2 equivalent to be produced. And then once you know that, then you're a long way to understanding your scope 2 emissions. So I think it's just, this really shows that the main obstacle to actually measuring especially your scope 1 and 2 emissions is the desire to get that data and finding out where that data comes from, because once you've got it, you can get a picture of your emissions there quite quickly. But like I said, I will share that with everyone after the call. So I'm going to take a quick break for questions here, because I realise I've sort of inundated you with information about the different scopes of emissions. So if anyone's got any questions about them, I would take them now. So again, feel free to put them in the chat or speak up and we can answer them on the call. Mark, I can see you've raised a hand.
Yeah, so
no question.
Oh, so we'll go Mark first because he put up his hand. Which is you don't have to put up your hand, but he did it, so we'll go with Mark.
Okay. Thank you, Hugh. Fascinating so far. So I'm currently in a shared office down at the Barclays Eagle Lab. So I'm hot desking, so I'm not here every day. There are other people coming and going. What portion in scope 2 am I reporting for my business?
So that's again, that's going to be it's this issue of communication, I'd say, Mark. So it's going to be a matter of getting in touch with the landlord, because they might have data that is specific for your business, or they will at least have the data that they can then figure it out on. So do you mean that people are also using the office space that you're in, the same office?
So let's say we've got, I don't know, let's say 20 people use the office space on a 5-day a month or 10-day a month. So is the principle, I was here for, here's the global, this is what the office used globally, and then I was one of 20 people and I was here for 50% of the time. Is that the logic that you apply?
I think as long as you can, when it comes to emissions reporting, as long as you can justify the calculation, then that's what's important. I think there is going to be there's some degree of estimation in it.
Of course,
but I think just having that understanding of proportionality and how much you're there compared to how much other people are there helps you figure that out, because obviously you don't want to be reporting for their emissions, because that's going to lead to double counting. So I think that's the approach to take there. As long as you can justify the way you're calculating it, it's okay.
Brilliant, thank you.
So was it Dave? Was it you who had the other question?
It was me.
Oh, sorry, Alistair.
Yeah. Hi. Okay. Hugh, can I ask you? So we're setting up a whiskey distillery, in Wiltshire. And we're very keen to be producing at carbon neutral from the offset, which we are going to find pretty difficult right now, but we think we can get very close to it without offsetting. One of our competitors it has produced their carbon sort of neutral document and sort of suggests that they're producing carbon neutral. So very expensive to get there, by the way. But when you look deep down into their document, you find sort of towards the end that they are offsetting some of their emissions, and they're doing this by planting trees in China. Now, who can audit that and check that that is actually the case? Because obviously China is still fairly quite closed to a lot of these things. How much of that? They may believe they're buying tree or planting trees, but how do you know the reality? Where's the audit? Who does that?
Yeah, that's a good question, Alistair. I mean, I don't want I don't want to palm it off until later, but I'll come on to that that sort of discussion around how you verify your offsets sort of later in the workshop. But I would say for now, I think with offsetting, there's been an explosion of verification bodies for it because it's become so popular as part of a green strategy recently. But there are, and I'll go into detail on them later, but there are bodies out there which sort of are leading verification programs with regards to carbon offsetting. So it's just making sure when you purchase the offsets, who's verifying them and making sure that they are planted in areas that won't be deforested straight away. So the trees, for example, will be allowed to come to maturity. And also that the trees wouldn't be planted if you hadn't paid for them as well. So
yeah, but I mean, it must be very hard to check that they haven't sold that same tree to 10 different companies.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why the verification partner who has approved that purchase is so important to use. So it's worth. There are a few of them whose names I'll come on to them. We'll come on to them later. But there are a few bodies out there who are sort of the gold standard of offsetting verification. So when you purchase your offsets, you want to make sure that they are the ones who have verified it because they will check things like that. Whereas sort of more Wild West gung-ho verification bodies probably won't check that sort of thing as closely. So it's just a matter of really looking at where it's coming from.
Yeah. My other question, actually, quickly, Hugh, is where's the balance between, producing with zero carbon emissions, but considering the factor of renewability? So with biomass, for example, you are, burning that tree that you've cut down and it's grown, and so it's taken the CO2 out of the atmosphere, and you're putting it back, but you're putting it back over 60 to 90 years, let's say. So whilst you could say that's producing it carbon neutral, you're actually not doing a great service to the environment from a renewables perspective. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So how do we calculate, how does that, from a consumer perspective, how does that come into the calculations that we make?
I think it's an interesting one. I think in terms of the exact detail of the emissions, I think that's probably something that you'd have to talk to an emissions consultant about. I think in terms of carbon reduction strategy, it's still a good approach because I think there's an understanding that the technology at the moment, like we said, it's not completely there. So the focus should be on carbon reduction. So as long as you're taking steps to reduce what your emissions output is at the moment, then those are positive steps that are going to lower your carbon footprint. So I think there's got to be an understanding in 2022. We don't necessarily have the power to reach net zero in the next few years, but what steps can we be doing to lower our carbon footprint at the moment? I think that's where what you're talking about then comes into the conversation.
Well, I think it's trying to sort of understand how the consumer perception of okay, we're trying to reduce our carbon emissions because we want to save the planet, but at the same time we know our customers want it, therefore they'll buy our products because we can say that we are. But saying we are because we're using biomass, where that's not as true as, let's say, using an AD unit, for example. Where that's grown in the plants and the food is grown in the year that it's used, or the week that it's used, or the season that it's used. So it's
it's a fine line.
Alistair, just quickly on your situation, I'm running a data center. We've also looked at biomass fuels in the background here. We quickly came to the conclusion that we can't look at that as the next wave of generation at all for what we're looking to do. So we're moving looking at sort of like green gas as part of our sort of like steps moving forward for power generation from that perspective. So the question I've probably got for Hugh is actually if we move completely off grid to do that power generation, from the national grid perspective and for that measurement side of it, where do they then take that base mark from if you're no longer taking your power from the grid to do that to a certain degree?
So I guess that's where you obviously couldn't do it from a location-based perspective then. So there's the grid data is obviously completely irrelevant to your production of energy. So I guess that's where you're figuring out the emissions that you'd have to do it yourself, I guess.
Yes, we've formulated our current base carbon at the moment, which we know we've taken from about a couple of years ago from when the site was fully operational. But it's just a case of, as we move forward, then do we still use that as a base model and our base footprint as we then sort of like monitor that going down? I guess get the National Grid just to say yes, you're not taking any supply as we then move forward. So how does that then work? So it's an interesting one. Yeah.
I think as well, I think just in terms of the emissions reporting, I think it's important to understand obviously you've got the numerical side of it, the table that will show what you're basing it off going forwards. But obviously the tech side of it, just as I was saying to Mark as well, just justifying your approach in there as well, just saying this is exactly how we've calculated this. Yes, we know it might not be 100% perfect at the moment, but this is what we're working with going forwards. We hope to improve the accuracy of it, and then reflecting that in subsequent reports as well.
Oh, cool. Okay, thanks for that.
Nice, thanks, John. Any more?
Yeah, Hugh, I had a brief question for you. When you were describing the terms, the basic terms earlier on, you described net zero as, in my words, not yours, lowering the emissions to the lowest bit possible and then offsetting. But when you looked at scope 1, 2, and 3, you had net zero as 100% reduction, 100% reduction, 90% reduction. If you're a new company and you set off fairly green, that net zero in scope 1, 2, and 3 is going to be nigh on impossible, isn't it?
Sorry, if you're a new company and you set off already fairly green, do you mean?
Yeah. So if we've got electric vehicles, we've got PV panels, we've got sustainable sources for food, as of the base year.
Yeah.
Then getting 100% reduction on that is going to be significantly harder than being, my words, nobody else's, a bad company, and sort of turning the corner and going green.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So I think what, and I'll come on to this in a bit, David, that I think what you could do, because obviously you are growing as a business, so hopefully the sort of metrics that you're measuring your business by will show that the business is expanding. So whether that's
the business is a startup business, so it's not really an existing business that is growing. It's a startup business.
Yeah,
a new dog kennels operation. It's nothing grand.
Yeah. But again, David, I think in that case, it's going to be a matter of telling the story through with words as well as numbers. I think, yes, you've got to understand that net zero, well, 100% reductions or significant reductions are going to be hard, and you're starting off from near net zero anyway. But it's just a matter of explaining next to your emissions data, just saying, look, we are already, when we set out as a business, our base year was pretty close to net zero. So reductions are not going to be incremental, but as a business, you are almost net zero anyway. So it's rather than looking at the reduction percentage, saying, look, as a business, we've nearly reached net zero from the outset. So our goal now is taking those last incremental steps to actually reach that position.
Okay.
Lovely. Right. So you are going to have a bit more of a chance to talk about emissions, which I'm sure you're all happy about, because it's time for another breakout room. And I'll put these questions in the chat so you can all have a look at them. But it's just going to focus on what we've been talking about in the last session to hopefully get you thinking about emissions in relation to your business. And I'll give you 15 minutes for this one because it's a bit more in depth. So if you could have a chat about what you think your biggest emission sources are going to be for your company, what types of scope 3 emissions do you think are going to be relevant for your business? And I'll send you the full list, the full 15 there, so you can have a look through them. And then obviously if you answered the first question with a scope 3 emission, then maybe come up with another scope 3 emission that you think is going to be big for your business. And then looking at the emission sources that you've discussed, can you start measuring emissions from them immediately? And if not, what are the obstacles that are preventing you from doing this? And have you got any ideas, or has anyone else got any ideas in your breakout room about how those issues can be overcome? So, like I said, I'll give you 15 minutes, and when we come back, I'll ask if anyone's got any feedback to the group, any sort of interesting discussion points that they had. So if you maybe want to nominate one person in your group to give me a little lowdown, that would be great. So I'll stop sharing. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope that was useful. I like the fact that 2 breakout rooms there were on until the last second. I like to think that's a positive sign. Does anyone have anything that they found particularly interesting, insightful, outrageous, shocking that they wanted to share from the discussions from those breakout rooms?
I think one of the things that we found really is just the magnitude of the challenge of it all. There's so many different things that we can look at. And as a result of there being so many different things that we can look at, it's sometimes a little bit overwhelming as to where to start. We eventually got somewhere on the trail of scope 3 and just looking at really supply chains and deliveries and travel, I guess, really being one of the biggest areas that we looked at.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, travel's an interesting one. I think a lot of companies sort of overlooked it a little bit in the last 2 years, obviously, especially commuting. But I think, yeah, everyone measuring now is going to have to get to grips with emissions from commuting, especially. Cool. Any more?
I think from our room, it's a very similar chat really to what you guys probably had. And the other one, it's just a case of, I think we can see there's lots of challenges in how we look to achieve this, but I think there's not really much guidance that we can see so far. I think that's why a lot of us are here right now, to understand what are going to be the best practices and how we can look to achieve these sort of measures and measurements. And that's sort of like how we can then drive our own strategy moving forward. And I think that's something that came quite clear from the conversations we were having. Yeah.
It is a big challenge. I think. I think like I mean, I'll sort of go into it later, but I think like any overwhelming challenge, that the thing to do is build a roadmap of where you want to go, where you want to start, and break it into more manageable chunks, rather than looking at the whole picture and thinking, my God, how am I ever going to deal with this? It's planning that strategy so you can actually develop it. I would say as well, in terms of this workshop, obviously it's a good chance to talk to you all about the different scopes of emissions, how to measure them and stuff. But I thought to really obviously get to grips with your own emissions, it's a very sort of personal journey, basically. So the advice of where to start, which emissions to look at, that's obviously going to be something that's quite tailored to each business. So without wanting to plug our own services too much, we do offer fully funded support. So feel free to book in a session with myself and give me a list of things that you're interested in talking further about, and obviously we can have one-to-one support as well there, just to bolster this. But this is hopefully going to give you good insight into things you can be doing to start. Cool. Has anyone got any other comments? I'm conscious. I realise I've had a break where you've been in the breakout rooms, but you guys have been non-stop for the best part of an hour and a half. So I've got a couple more slides to go through, and then I'll give you sort of 15 minutes to stretch your legs and make a cup of tea. Okay. I'll reshare my screen. So what we're going to look at next is what to do with the emissions data once you've got it. And once your initial carbon footprint measurement, which you're going to get by adding together the total CO2 equivalent figures from each of the 3 scopes of emissions, once you've got that, the next step is obviously going to actually be reporting on these emissions, so that all interested stakeholders can see how you're getting on. And this should be a report that gets published externally, so you're not just sitting on it and keeping it internal and using it for internal purposes. Because if you measure but keep the results to yourself and don't publish those plans, then you're again running the risk of getting accused of greenwashing, because you're not taking that sufficient action against climate change, because you need to be transparent with the results that you're finding. And if you're trying to cover things up, it's not a good look. So that's not to say that the results shouldn't inform what goes on internally. They absolutely should inform what's going on internally within your business, but you've got to make that data public. And it will really also hold you to any commitments that you're making. Because obviously, if you say something out loud, then it's much harder to take back, which is a great thing when it comes to carbon reduction commitments. So putting your commitments out there and publishing them is a really good thing to do in the guise of a carbon report. And you've got a few options when it comes to carbon reporting. And the first is that you could do it as a similar process to any financial reports that you publish. So you could publish your carbon emissions data and then explain any divergences. So if some of your emissions have gone up rather than down, or any outstanding successes, you can explain that data in the text. And then this could be part of your annual report, or it could be sort of part of a wider sustainability focused report. It depends on where you want to take it as a business, really. And it's obviously up to you. I would perhaps recommend the sort of devoted sustainability report approach, just because you have more of an opportunity to go into greater depth here, where the sustainability is really the focus of the entire report. And there are initiatives out there as well that give you guidelines for how exactly to structure these reports and what to include in them. So the most popular is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which gives you clear guidance on exactly how to lay out and report your emissions. But then there are also standards by the Global Reporting Initiative and the International Standards Organization that give you a framework for going into wider commentary about the carbon emissions that you're seeing. Of the last two, I think ISO is definitely more popular, but I think GRI gives a stronger framework for its carbon reporting emissions. But it's subjective. It's entirely up to you. I think it's a matter of looking into the frameworks that both recommend and seeing what might work best for your business. And then if you want to go one step further, you can report your emissions through a platform which will verify that your report is sound and accurate. And these exist because it's often thought that if it's only your business that decides whether your report is accurate enough, then you might be considered to be marking your own homework. And I only just recall doing my homework at school, but I can guarantee that if I'd marked my own homework, I would have got much better marks than if the teachers marked it. So the worry here is basically the same. It's that if you're marking your own emissions data, you'll give yourself the benefit of the doubt. And in some situations, you might not report as thoroughly as you should, but you would just overlook that. And there are lots of platforms out there that can give you this verification, this tick. Planet Mark is one that was recommended to me by my colleague at the Gloucestershire LEP, but it's worth doing your research to find out what's out there and what's the right fit for your business, and also what's the right price mark as well, because I think they can charge around sort of between £2,000 and £3,000. That sort of verification. So obviously verification isn't something that you need to do as a business, but if you want to go down that route, then it's understanding the options that are out there. Carbon Trust is another one that's popular in the UK as well. So those are a couple to look out for. So this is a carbon report that is taken from the fashion retailer Boohoo, who are pretty poorly renowned for their sustainability because they obviously operate in fast fashion, but they serve the purpose of this slide nicely. And that's firstly because they show how to lay out a numerical carbon footprint report. So you've got the different scopes of emissions, and then within scope 3 especially, you can see that they've looked at all of the different categories that are important to their business. But the main reason I wanted to bring this up is because Boohoo establish an intensity metric for their emissions, which you can see highlighted by my excellent artwork there at the bottom. And intensity measurements just let you compare your emissions to a particular variable. So like square footage of office space or employee count, but Boohoo have chosen total revenue. So they figured out these by dividing their CO2 equivalent emissions by their total revenue figure. And these intensity metrics are really useful as they are encouraging growing businesses to report on their carbon footprint. And by this, I mean, if a business is getting bigger, then it's likely that its output is rising, which will mean that its emissions are also going to be going up. And knowing this can deter a lot of businesses from actually wanting to report on their carbon emissions, as they will look like they are getting worse. I think this is an important conversation to have with SMEs and startups, because obviously that growth can be coming quite quickly. So understanding this is an important piece to the puzzle. So the intensity measurement allows you to put your emissions in terms of your growth. So you're comparing them to your particular growth KPI, so total revenue or one of the others that I mentioned earlier. And then what that means is that even if you're growing, as long as you're making efforts to reduce your carbon emissions, then your CO2 footprint in terms of your intensity measurement is going to be coming down. And obviously, ultimately, you still have to get to zero, to net zero. But it means that as a business, you won't look like you are failing in relation to your sustainability commitments, which is obviously important. You don't want to be seen as being a non-green business. And then obviously you can go into depth in terms of explaining that in a little bit more detail in your report, saying this is the intensity metric we focused on. And you can see that in relation to our growth, it's coming down. Hopefully your emissions are coming down. Mark, that's very good timing on the hand raised, because I think before I give you a 15-minute break or so to get some tea, I will take any questions for the first half of the workshop, really. So if you've got anything to ask, please go now. Mark, take it away.
Thank you. Well, just on that last report, there didn't seem, and maybe we haven't seen the whole report, but there didn't seem to be any space in that balance sheet for offsetting. It was just outputs.
Yeah, so that was, I think in terms of offsetting, it's a separate, basically it would be a separate table. So that would be, if you wanted to report on your offsets, you could do it as a separate table or in a line of text that basically says we have purchased X amount of carbon offsets to offset 80% of our emissions.
Yeah, there was no maths there to talk about their journey towards. There was a last year's figure and a this year's figure in intensity, but there wasn't actually a reduction against their net zero target. You know,
no,
that's so okay. So that will be looked at separately.
That'll be looked at separately. And again, I think in terms of the steps that you're taking towards net zero, that's why you need the written part of your carbon report, because the numbers they can't tell the whole story. So that's why you need to go into depth and explain exactly the steps that you're taking. And obviously, Boohoo are not notorious for they are notorious for their lack of sustainability, I guess. So that's the chance to explain why your numbers might be going up, or try and explain it. I'm not sure how successfully they do it, but that's why that part of the sustainability report is so crucial as well.
Cool. Thank you.
Has anyone got any other questions? Okay, lovely. Well, I'll hang around as well while you guys take a break. So if you want to come back at 10 to 11, we'll crack on with the second part of the workshop. Lovely. Right, yeah, I'll get back into it just because I'm conscious of time. We've got a few guest presenters in this the second part of this presentation, so that's very exciting. I'd like to get on to them. But you had a nice cup of tea, coffee, glass of wine, whatever you went for, and yeah, we'll get start back in. So the next part of this session is going to look at how you can build your carbon reduction strategies. So when you're at this point, we are assuming that you've done the stuff that we spoke about in the first part of the workshop. So you've measured your different scopes of emissions and you've got an idea what your carbon footprint is. And then only once you've done that, should you then move on to the stuff that we're going to cover in the rest of the workshop. Because if you haven't measured your carbon footprint, then as we said at the start, any plan to lower that carbon footprint might not be actually targeting the areas where you're really boosting your emissions at the moment. The other thing to say also, before you undertake a carbon reduction strategy execution, you should make sure obviously that you've got the resources, so the staff, the time, the bandwidth to execute it properly as well. Otherwise, that's going to be a bit of a failed project. So just understanding your internal capabilities is important before you get into this as well. But after this part of the workshop, hopefully, you'll have a bit of an understanding of how to set effective short-term and long-term carbon reduction targets. You'll be able to communicate your green credentials and avoid being called a greenwasher. You have an idea of how to engage your employees and your staff with your sustainability efforts, as well as your suppliers as well. And you might be aware of the financial assistance options that are out there to support green growth. For some reason, everyone always gets very excited when I talk about the finance part. I have no idea why. I'm also going to go through the sort of pledges and commitments that you can make to bolster your carbon reduction strategies as well, and a couple more breakout rooms along the way. So that's what's in store for the next hour and a bit. So let's get stuck in. The first part of your strategy, to reduce your carbon emissions, should be, once you've measured, to set some emissions reduction targets. Just because everyone works better when they've got something to work towards, and carbon reduction is the same. So get some clear targets set out for your business in terms of emission reduction to give you and your workforce something to push for. And then it also really helps direct your carbon reduction strategy as well, because if you've got clear targets, your strategy can then be tailored to meet those targets. And then in that way, it can be a useful director for your strategy at the outset. So if you're unsure of how exactly to start with regards to a long-term carbon reduction plan, then setting these targets is a really useful indicator. I've got a few tips with regards to the targets that you set yourself. So the first one is to come up with some long-term targets and put them in place for your carbon reduction goals. And these are so useful because they are a great way to make clear what your green ambitions are to your customers, to your staff, suppliers, all other stakeholders. And they're also a good starting point for thinking about your carbon reduction strategy as well. Because once you have in place long-term carbon footprint targets, then you can start thinking about how you achieve these through strategy design. And in that way, that target should be the crux of all your strategic decisions. So how does this help us get nearer to our targets? And then in terms of what these long-term targets are, you can make sort of wider statements relating to your overall carbon reduction plans and your emissions levels. So popular ones sort of refer back to the terms that we spoke about at the start of the workshop. So things like we'll become net zero by a specific year, we'll become carbon neutral by a specific year, or we'll lower our carbon footprint by a specific percentage by a specific year. So most people would normally say we'll lower our carbon footprint by 50% by 2030, because that's a nice halfway house to obviously then achieving net zero. The second tip here we've got is to supplement these long-term targets with shorter-term targets. And this is because, again, as with all targets that are 10 to 20 years in the future, they don't really inspire the sort of immediate action, and especially the sort of immediate action that's needed to tackle the climate crisis. So to keep yourself on track for those more distant targets, you should look to set shorter term targets as well. So for example, you might want to be net zero by 2040, but you could also set yourself a target of being net zero in your scope 2 emissions by 2023, then net zero in your scope 1 emissions by 2030, and net zero in all of your scope 3 emissions by 2040. You could also even go more granular than that. So looking at scope 3, you might want to be net zero in terms of employee commuting by 2027, net zero in terms of distribution of goods by 2035. Another approach to these short-term targets, you could say, I want to reduce my carbon emissions by X% each year. So for example, if you want to halve your emissions by 2030, you'll need to reduce your emissions by just over 6% each year. So that's another approach that you could take to setting those short-term targets. Obviously, whatever works for you, whatever works for your business, really. And then I think setting a range of these short-term targets and meeting them, again, helps you work towards those longer-term targets gradually and keep on track with meeting them. And it also makes these bigger targets seem a bit more achievable, which is great because they can be quite intimidating. As we found out, they can deter businesses from dealing with their emissions. So again, they inform strategy and they really keep you focused on that longer-term goal. And then finally, make sure your targets are SMART. And I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with SMART targets and the acronym. But if you're not, I'll go through them quickly now, especially in relation to carbon reduction. So SMART is obviously an acronym. The S stands for specific targets. So using real numbers and real deadlines. So for example, reduce carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. Rather than just, I want to reduce our emissions, full stop. So making sure you've got real targets in there. And the M is for measurable. So you've got to be able to track progress. So make sure that it's quantitative and you can see how you're doing against your targets. Obviously, that's sort of what we've been through in the first part of this workshop as well. So that's useful. The A is for attainable. So you want to be setting targets that are tough but achievable. You don't want to do everything overnight. You don't want to try to do that because you'll just miss your targets and demoralize your team. But at the same time, you don't want to be setting yourself targets that you're going to achieve way ahead of time and they're actually easily within the limits in your business, because again, you want to be doing as much as you can to obviously tackle the climate crisis. Realistic targets is the R, and this is about knowing what you're capable of as a team. And we've spoken about this a couple of times, but it's just understanding what obstacles are in the way of you achieving your target. And then factoring that in when you're setting your target. So it could be the number of staff, it could be a complicated supply chain or customer unwillingness to change. All of those obstacles that are going to lengthen the amount of time it takes to reach your target. So it's important to identify those and build them in when you're setting those targets. And then finally, T is time-bound targets. So giving yourself a deadline for targets. So not just soon or someday, giving yourself a very specific timeline. So sort of like setting the targets for 2030 again is a good example. I think that's quite similar to specific, but I think SMART is a better acronym than SMART. So I think that's why they mentioned that one. Okay, another way that you can think about your target setting is to say, what are my total emissions? And then based on that, if I want to lower my emissions by as much as possible by, say, 2030 in order to achieve net zero, what percentage do I have to reduce them by each year? And to help with this, I'm going to draw your attention to another free Excel-based tool, which is run by Planet Mark, who I mentioned earlier. And again, I'll share this tool with you after the session so you can have a play around. But essentially, as hopefully you can see by the slide, you put in the percentage of your scopes 1 to 3 emissions that you're able to reduce. And then you input the percentage of your emissions that you can't reduce, that you need to have to continue to operate as a business. So here I've said that my scopes 1 to 3 that I can reduce make up for 80% of my emissions, leaving 20% of my emissions as unavoidable residual emissions that are going to be left over. So once I reach 80% reduction, I'm net zero. So you can then select the start year and the year you want to achieve net zero by, as well as your current target. So I'm starting in 2021 because I haven't updated this slide since I did it last year. And I want to achieve my net zero target by 2030. And I'm currently trying to reduce my emissions by 10% each year. And then you'll then be told how much you'll need to lower your carbon emissions by per year to reach your net zero target by your target year. So in this instance, my target of 10% reduction isn't enough for my target of 2030. I actually need to cut my emissions by 18% per year. So obviously I need to make changes to my strategy to move some of my targets forward, or I need to set a more realistic deadline for me becoming net zero. And then you can see the graph at the bottom as well shows how this differs, how this 18% differs to the 10% target that you've got at the moment. And it shows where you have to do more. So to be net zero, I need to get to 20% of my emissions levels by 2021. Sorry, I need to get 20% of my 2021 emissions levels, but it shows that if I only reduce my CO2 footprint by 10% each year, that by 2030, when I want to reach net zero, I'll still have 40% of my 2021 emissions left over. So I failed to meet that target there. Hello, I've flicked through a few slides accidentally. There we go. And then obviously that I think the last thing to be said about that curve is obviously it's never smooth, but it gives an idea. And in reality, your emissions are going to drop quickly at first and then slower afterwards, because at the start you're going to make easy changes, and we'll come on to that a bit in a second. And then later on, as time goes by, the changes are going to be harder and harder to make. So the curve will flatten out somewhat in terms of emissions reduction. Okay, so what tips can we give you to actually developing an emissions reduction plan? And this is something that's quite a hard slide to put together, because all of your strategies are going to be so different to each other's, because you're all individuals, you're all unique, but also you're in different sectors and you have obviously different issues as businesses. So the advice here is fairly high level, generic, but I would say it's also a good idea to, once you consider this and thought about how it applies to your business, to book in a one-to-one appointment with me so we can talk through exactly how it applies to your company as well. So when you're putting together your strategy for carbon reduction, a good starting point is to look at your carbon footprint across your whole supply chain, the whole value chain, and identify two things which inform our first two tips on this slide. And the first tip here is to search your carbon footprint report for any low-hanging fruit. And these are sources of emissions which can easily be dealt with and will take up a big chunk of your carbon footprint. So the first tip is to pick the low-hanging fruit, as it were. Sorry, some water. The first tip is to pick the low-hanging fruit emissions, so the ones that are easier to reduce. And typically going after these involves actions like putting LED light bulbs into your office, or setting up a rideshare scheme at work, or changing to a green energy tariff. But all of these are relatively inexpensive, quick changes that you can make to lower your carbon footprint, hence the term low-hanging fruit. But whatever that low-hanging fruit is, taking steps to lower emissions in these sources has to be the first part of your net zero strategy, because it's easy and everyone loves a quick win, and it's going to get stakeholders on side from an early stage when they can see that you're actually taking action to lower your carbon footprint. The other thing you want to look at in your carbon footprint is so-called carbon hotspots. And these are the sources which make up the bulk of your emissions. And this is something which is obviously going to vary massively from business to business. So for some of you, you'll probably find that the energy use by your office is the main source of your emissions. Others might find that it's disposing of waste materials, or distribution of goods to customers, or even the goods you buy from suppliers. But whatever it is, the next stage of developing your net zero strategy can then be to say, okay, I know my carbon hotspots, so how do I get emissions from these sources lower? Because these are the biggest chunk of your carbon footprint. And it's important to understand that this isn't going to be as immediate as the low-hanging fruit. It's going to require more detailed planning over a longer time frame. So if we have an example, sort of contextualize it, say I'm a clothing manufacturer, and once I look at my carbon footprint, I find that my carbon hotspots are the main sources of my emissions. are the emissions caused by the creation of the materials I use in my clothes and the disposal of waste from excess fabric in the manufacturing phase. Once I know this, I can look to identify a strategy to lower emissions from these sources. So rather than use unsustainable fabrics, I could switch to a circular model. So I could reuse material that already exists rather than making new fabric. Similarly, I could look at my purchasing order quantity or my product design stages and look to design waste out of the manufacturing process to eliminate the emissions associated with waste. And then both of those actions would drastically cut the emissions from my carbon hotspots there. Then moving on to our third tip, once you've got a strategy in place for your carbon hotspots, that's when you can start to actually expand your horizons and look at the other sources of emissions. So they're not as immediate wins as low-hanging fruit, and they don't make up as much percentage of your overall carbon footprint as carbon hotspots, but emissions that are still important to your carbon footprint that you need to reduce as you move towards net zero. And in a similar way, you can cut the targets for those and aim to reduce them. Now, and I think we've alluded to this quite a lot already, but there are going to be some unavoidable emissions, because no matter how hard you try, these are going to stick around because companies always need a small amount of emissions just to keep the business alive. And as you can't deal with these through a carbon reduction plan, our final tip here is to offset the equivalent amount. So we went through carbon offsetting in the first session, so I won't define it again here. But the idea, obviously, if you've got 10 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions left over as residual emissions, then you have to offset that by taking 10 tons out of the atmosphere through your carbon offsetting. So you'll need to set up a plan for that, and that can include finding somewhere to buy offsets, which you're sure is a verified scheme. I think it was Alistair asked earlier about verification for offsets. So the pinnacle of carbon offsets are companies called, so the gold standard offset is number one, the verified carbon standard is number two, and the climate action reserve number three. And obviously you have this as a recording later, so you can look back and I'll draw those out in an email, but those are the most widely accepted excellent verification schemes for carbon offsetting. There are others out there as well, but I think those are the most widely used and widely understood as excellent verification schemes for carbon offsetting. So you'll want to understand where your offsets are coming from, and having that verification there is a very useful procedure. So like I said, I won't go into what carbon offsetting is again here, as we have just gone through that. But in terms of its uses for business, obviously offsetting is the tool that companies are going to use to claim that they are carbon neutral and also net zero eventually. So offsetting is obviously the most widely used method for taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And there are loads of initiatives out there where you can buy offsets, and that number is increasing all the time, as we were talking about earlier, as offsetting becomes more popular. So I think it's good to understand the options that are available in terms of carbon offsetting. And I think if you want to use it as part of your green strategy, then there are really two categories within offsetting that you need to be aware of. So the first is carbon sequestration offsets, which is also known as carbon removal. So these offsets take CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it. So they normally consist of nature-based projects like reforestation, afforestation, or projects which improve peatlands or coastal vegetation, because all of those act as carbon stores. On the other hand, you've also got carbon avoidance offsets, and these are projects which seek to avoid carbon being put into the atmosphere in the first place. So this could be anything from paying to protect a rainforest from being logged, or paying to have more renewable energy put into the grid. And at present, carbon avoidance offsets are less popular than sequestration, as I think measuring how much carbon has been saved by avoiding an action is quite a significant challenge. So you can't see exactly how impactful your project has been. So businesses obviously prefer to be able to measure the outcomes of what they're purchasing. So I think for that reason, this isn't something that's used as widely, but it's certainly obviously an effective method of stopping carbon being released into the atmosphere. There are a lot of things that have been said about carbon offsetting, which I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, and its effectiveness. So I think it would be a bit irresponsible of me to present it as this holy grail, which obviously I don't believe it is. But I think it's a good idea just to run through the pitfalls that are associated with carbon offsetting. And the first of these is an over-reliance on offsetting. And by this, I mean that you rely on it too much as part of your green strategy. So it's a great way of compensating for your emissions, but the goal for your carbon reduction plan has got to be to lower your emissions rather than to offset them. And that is much more valuable than offsetting. It needs to be the basis of all reduction plans. So with offsetting being used to a lesser extent to reach net zero than carbon neutral, that's why net zero should be the focus, because that focuses more on reduction than carbon neutrality. But offsetting tends to distract, I think, from the ultimate goal of lowering your emissions. And I think it's important that if you are doing it as part of your green strategy, you don't overemphasize it and you actually do focus on the emissions reductions piece instead. We spoke about this a little bit earlier, but you've also got to watch out for buying carbon offsets through unverified carbon offsetting schemes. And verification is obviously the best way to confirm that the purchases are doing what you want them to. And when you're buying offsets, you really need to check that they offer additionality. So this means that the benefits from the offset you're purchasing wouldn't have happened without your offset purchase. And verification through the schemes that we mentioned earlier is one way of covering that off. And you also want to make sure that they offer durability. So taking the example of tree planting, you want to make sure they're planted in areas which have been confirmed as a tree planting project and aren't going to be at risk of being cut down in the future. Again, otherwise the value of your offsets is not what you think it is. And if you're presenting it as something that is not in your carbon footprint report, again, you do run that risk of being labelled a greenwasher. And like I said, there are standards out there. So just a reminder, gold standard, verified carbon standard, and the climate action reserve are the big three. But just check the verification of any offsets that you're buying. Check it's a reputable scheme, because you don't want to obviously waste your money and harm your reputation by buying from an unverified provider there. The last thing to watch out for is greenwashing, which is a term obviously we've mentioned a lot and we will come on to again in a bit more detail later. But this is where you're making claims about your green credentials when you haven't got any sort of basis for it. And obviously it encompasses diversionary tactics, as I said earlier, so pointing to one part of your business to hide another part of your business. And I think in terms of offsetting, it really lends itself to being labelled as a greenwasher, because you are by habit saying, look at the amazing work we're doing with tree planting, to perhaps deter people from looking at the fact that you haven't done as much as you would like to with regards to reducing your emissions. So I think the important thing here is understanding the role that offsetting plays and not presenting it as something it's not. So the next breakout room, we're going to do, I would like you to talk about what we've just spoken about here, really. So what do you think are some of the low-hanging fruit emissions that you might be able to quickly reduce? So imagine that you have conducted a carbon footprint report. What do you think are some of the things as a business you might be able to quickly change to reduce your emissions? What emissions do you think you'll have which are going to be harder to reduce? So what do you think you're going to have to come up with a more strategic approach for, which might take a longer time? And also what sort of longer term strategies can you think of that might help you reduce your emissions? Obviously, you're saying a 15-minute breakout room. So I don't expect you to come up with strategies that are drastically going to change everyone's business model. But what sort of things do you think might be actually useful for bringing down your emissions in the long run? I will post the questions in the chat quicker than I did last time. But I'll put you back into breakout rooms now. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. My timekeeping has been predictably pretty shoddy today. So I think rather than do a bit of a debrief of discussion points from that, I'll just ask quickly if anyone's got any questions arising from it that they'd like to ask, and then we'll get cracking with the rest of the presentation.
I got one question. It's not necessarily what we were talking about, but it's to do with home working. So with regards to tracking people at home, say, for example, we've got, I don't know, 50 people working from home. At what level do you go into then to ask the question about, okay, well, what about your house? How environmentally sound is your house?
Yeah, it's a good question. There is, let's say, something we're sort of grappling with at the moment as well. There's a good white paper out there by EcoAct and Lloyd's, which I'll share afterwards so everyone's got access to it. But that gives quite a good sort of base understanding of what to measure with regards to the carbon emissions you're producing when working from home. So that's a good starting point there. And then I guess with regards to asking people how much they'll reduce their emissions, it's totally up to you. Really, it's going to depend on the size of it as a proportion of your overall emissions. Is it really important that you lower your working from home emissions? And also, I guess, is that going to be the future working model going forwards, or is that something that's going to drop off drastically in the next year or so for you? And then you can look into, I think it's a line between forcing them to do it and getting buy-in for the whole idea of a green strategy, basically. So it's the way that you go about asking them to make changes, maybe rather than asking them to drastically change their energy provider or something like that, just little changes around the house to lower their emissions might be better. But it's an interesting area, that one, I think, Daniel.
Thank you.
No worries. Any other questions? Lovely. Let's move on. Okay. So if you go by what we said in the last section about greenwashing, you might sort of be saying to yourself a little bit at the moment, well, how the hell can I not be called a greenwasher? It seems I can't do anything without having that label slapped on me. I think the good news is that there are obviously ways that you can not be called a greenwasher, and the most fail-safe way is to be net zero, because obviously if you are genuinely net zero, where your emissions are as low as they can feasibly be, then you can make the claim about the greenness of your business, of the operations that you're doing, without running the risk of greenwashing, because as a business you are as green as you can possibly be in that sense. The only thing you'd have to be careful about there is comparing yourself to other businesses and saying we're much greener than our competitors, because again, you've got to have the evidence from the competitor to actually back that up with solid data. Obviously, though, you're not going to turn into a net zero company overnight. So I think a lot of what you're doing when you're communicating your environmental goals is going to be about keeping your stakeholders engaged with your process and being very transparent with them about what's going on. And I think there are a few things that you can do to support this. The first is just being consistent in your activities. So saying one thing and doing another thing is obviously never a good look. Instead, you need to sort of embrace where you are with regards to talking about your sustainability journey and just be very transparent about it. So if you aren't quite where you want to be as a business with regards to your carbon footprint, acknowledge that and sort of own it and say, look, yes, we're not where we want to be. We're working towards it. And these are our plans to get us there by a specific year. And that sort of honesty and transparency is going to eliminate the risk of greenwashing and sort of just set you up with your stakeholders as being an honest business. I think similarly, you need to be able to substantiate any claims that you're making about your green credentials. So obviously don't just say we're the greenest sock company in the Southwest. You've got to prove it. Otherwise, people are going to ask to see your evidence. So when you're talking about this to stakeholders, make sure you've got the evidence that ready to roll out and support the claims that you're making. And then also you're going to want to align your investments with your sustainability goals. So again, stakeholders are going to be keeping a close eye on whether the claims that you make about how green you are align with how you're spending your money. And this is obviously going to cover all sorts of investments. So for financial institutions making investments into other projects, they need to ensure that these are sharing any net zero ambitions that they might have. The emissions caused by that investment are going to form part of their scope 3 emissions. So if the project is high polluting, then it's going to risk sort of scuppering their net zero ambitions there. I think for other organisations, the big one to look at is your pensions. So what do your pension funds invest that money in? Are they supporting fossil fuel projects? I was at a talk with the FSB a few months ago, and they pointed out that switching your pension provider, if it's investing in fossil fuel projects, is the biggest thing as a step as a company that you can take to actually slash your carbon footprint. I'm not sure what data they were using, but it seemed like a good statement at the time. But I think the important thing to take away from that it is a useful tool to actually lower your carbon footprint. And there are plenty of pension providers out there who have fossil fuel free pension schemes in place. So the one that was mentioned at the FSB talk was Pension B, but obviously other pension providers are available. And I think finally, I think with the investment subcategory, we also need to look at the money we're spending on hardware and software. So as well as other aspects of things like acquiring companies, then this is the same. You're spending your money on things that, if you are spending your money on things that don't support your green claims and where you want to be going as a business, then you're going to end up being called a greenwasher. So it's important to consider exactly how you're spending your money there as well. But I think the important thing to take away from this slide is it's essentially about whether you walk your talk or not. I think is where we need to leave this slide. And then in terms of where you communicate your environmental goals as well, this is another area that you're going to have to consider. So PR agencies are obviously going to be able to advise you better here and give you advice about placements in magazines or local news. But having a strategy to, I guess, communicate your environmental message through a number of channels is important. And I think it's a good opportunity to point out SWLEP's digital support. So we can help you come up with a social marketing plan that will communicate your green credentials effectively. And I can put you in contact with my colleague Letitia there, who can offer support around that as well. Okay, we're going to have a look in the next two slides at bringing suppliers and employees into your green strategy and how you can do that and why it's important. So if we start with suppliers, getting suppliers to align with your environmental sustainability goals is obviously vital to the success of your green strategy. And this is just because your scope 3 emissions, which often make up the bulk of your company carbon footprint, are driven in a large way by your suppliers. So you've got emissions created by goods or services that you purchase, and also emissions from upstream and downstream transport of parts and goods. And these are two of the biggest constituent parts of scope 3, and how many emissions you'll rack up in each all depends on how green your suppliers are. So all this means that even if you are as green as you can be in your own operations, if your suppliers aren't on board with that vision, then you'll never reach that state of net zero, and lowering your emissions is going to be a real challenge. But on the other hand, if all your suppliers are also going for a similar net zero target, then that's actually going to go a long way to lowering your own carbon footprint, which is fantastic. So it is obviously really important that you align with your current suppliers with their environmental goals, or that you find new suppliers that can support you in achieving those goals. So let's assume that you choose to continue working with your current suppliers to meet your carbon reduction goals. You're going to need to collaborate with them to work effectively towards those targets. And this collaboration between yourself and your suppliers is obviously with the aim of helping to lower the suppliers' emissions too, which obviously has the excellent knock-on effect of lowering your emissions. And it's a collaboration that can come in a number of different forms. So, for example, you could share data back with your suppliers about any excess inventory left over from orders from them, which is contributing to your waste, and disposal of that is adding to your emissions. Or it could even be putting your suppliers in touch with relevant contacts who can help them develop green initiatives as well. But most of the time, hopefully, it's not about changing your suppliers for someone who's greener, but about working with your existing suppliers to reach a level of sustainability that's beneficial to both of you. I think suppliers are sometimes going to be reluctant to make this change at first, but if it's laid out to them in terms of, look, this is where the industry's going, you have to change, you're going to be left behind, they might be more willing to make that change. And if not, it's always worth explaining it to them in financial terms. So that's to say, you could explain it to them, it's better for the bottom line in terms of resource efficiency and energy efficiency. You will ultimately see profitability increase as well. And then I think if suppliers are still unwilling to make that change, then you may want to consider, obviously, a greener supply option. And this is something you might see reluctance from suppliers to become greener if you are dealing with a business that's more powerful than your own, that has more bargaining power than you do, because you might make up only a small percentage of their overall sales. So they might not be willing to make that change for you, but it is always worth having that conversation with them. And it could even be worth joining with other customers of that supplier to almost lobby them to change their policy there. Okay, moving on to your employees and bringing them into your environmental strategy, because they do play a huge role in the emissions that you create. So not just the emissions caused by working from home, like Daniel was talking about there, but also commuting and traveling for business as well. And they also obviously make decisions on behalf of your business around purchasing and supplier selection and investments, which are also going to have a knock-on effect for your carbon reduction plan. So getting employee buy-in for what you're doing is really important. And engaging and involving your staff with supporting your creation of a carbon reduction plan is something that's a really good idea. And there are two reasons this is such an effective strategy. And the first is that a workforce that doesn't understand why you're trying to reduce your emissions or what you're trying to achieve is going to hold back your plans. So they'll carry on with business as usual, and they will resist changes that are coming from management that are designed to reduce emissions. And obviously, you want to avoid this. So you'll need to make sure that staff are fully aware of what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that can have a really positive impact on your carbon reduction plan. The second reason that involving your staff in your carbon reduction strategy is a good idea is that they can be a great source of insight as to the best way to cut emissions associated with your business. And by this, I mean, for a business to lower its carbon footprint, obviously each role within the company is going to have a carbon output associated with it. And if staff are trained to understand how carbon emissions in a business work, then they are the ones who are working in each role and who are best placed to identify the emissions associated with that job, and then subsequently come up with ideas of how to lower those emissions. And that could be part of your wider carbon reduction strategy too. So give them the tools to understand carbon emissions, so increasing their carbon literacy and understanding carbon measurement, and they can pay you back with ideas for reducing your emissions as well. In terms of actually how you engage your staff with your carbon reduction goals, there are a few ways, obviously, to get the importance of the strategy across to them. So this could be organising information sessions or encouraging debates and questions, going through actual internal training processes with them around new skills that they might have to learn, especially, and also actually getting employee feedback and buy-in on the reduction plans as they're produced. Basically anything you can do to get that buy-in, and obviously you know your staff best, so it's up to you to think about, okay, what's going to engage my workforce at this stage. And then once you've got that buy-in, you can sort of look to keep engagement going, obviously with regular updates, or even things like Green Employee of the Month, so who's come up with the best ideas, or who has lowered their individual carbon footprint the most. Something like that. I mean, some of you might be thinking that is a terrible idea, that will never work for my workforce. Some of you might be thinking that's actually quite a good strategy, I might follow through with something like that. But obviously it's going to completely depend on you and your individual business. Okay. So the rest of the session is sort of going to look at avenues to support your business in going green. And with that in mind, like I said, we've got a few guest speakers along to talk about some of the resources that they provide, that you can be taking advantage of, that you might not be aware of. So now we've got representatives from, actually I think Rob from Swindon Borough Council is not on the call at the moment. He might join us later. But we have got Rachel Johnson from Wiltshire Council, who's going to talk us through what the councils have been doing to support businesses lowering their carbon footprint, what the council is doing itself in terms of carbon reduction. So I'd like to welcome Rachel, and if you want to ask any questions, I think save them to the end and we'll go through them then as well. I'll stop sharing my screen, Rachel, so you can take over.
Super. So yes, thank you for this opportunity. I'm Rachel. I'm part of the Economy and Enterprise team at Wiltshire Council. As many of you will know, Wiltshire Council declared a climate emergency back in 2019. And in doing so, it set up a climate emergency task group, and it, to gather evidence and to come up with recommendations so that we can achieve our goal of being a carbon neutral council by 2030, but also a county, a carbon neutral county by 2030. So that's no mean feat, as you've probably gathered listening to Hugh this morning. As part of that commitment, the task group report to our cabinet every 6 months. And there is a dedicated website, and there's the link there. So if anybody hasn't already had a look, you can go and visit that. So since the climate emergency was confirmed in Wiltshire, we've progressed several areas, and we recognise that this is very much the start of our journey. So, and as you can imagine, the council covers many areas, so some of the activities have been around our built environment, so our house building programme, supporting our residents to access grants to retrofit some of their properties. We've worked very closely with the Warm and Safe Wiltshire programme, as well as producing strategies and policies to support different infrastructure. So, looking at biodiversity in areas, and all these are available on the Wiltshire Council website if you want to go and have a look. Some of the other ones you may have seen, around our cycling and walking plans across some of our main market towns. And then there's some sort of, as Hugh would suggest, the low-hanging fruit, so changing the street lights. And these are some of the items we discussed in the breakout rooms earlier. So, we're also looking at the transport network, across our fleets. There's so many different avenues that we can look at our carbon reduction in that aim to becoming carbon neutral. And our natural environment plan and the climate strategy have both been proposed, ready for the council on the 1st of February, and that's just been published. And as you can see, some of these measures show that carbon reduction can be applied across all areas of building, from the buildings that you work, the way you supply your materials and your goods, both incoming and outgoing, the transport you use on sites and to deliver your service. So there's a huge range of ways that you can apply these reductions with a goal of being carbon neutral. And your contributions have really helped Wiltshire Council in developing our strategy. So some of you may be aware that last autumn We had a public consultation. I think there was some face-to-face activities in libraries, as well as some online webinars. And over 1,000 residents, businesses and local groups commented on that draft climate strategy. And that's helped us to present it over 7 different themes. So as I've said before, you know, it's like transport, built environment, waste, which is an area that was discussed earlier in this webinar, energy generation, natural environment, food and farming. So these are all key issues and areas that we can apply changes and measures and look at where those investments and resources need to be applied. And as a local authority, we engage and support our business communities from our, you know, SMEs, of which I think we're well over 90% SMEs as a county, through to our Wiltshire 100 network. So they represent our largest and fastest growing organisations. If you want to keep up to date with what's happening from a council point of view, there's a news page and you can filter that by climate. So you can see we've regularly updated as to some of those things that we are doing, but also schemes that we're supporting. You know, you can see that one, the HGV through Bath and that. So that's just some of the most recent ones. So in terms of what you can do as an organisation, as Hugh's mentioned several times today, the number one thing you can do is calculate your organisation's carbon footprint. You know, knowing that footprint helps you baseline your activities, you can prioritise your action, but also focus on where those improvements can be made. There's a number of options for getting that evidence together. Target 2030 is one of the programmes that we promote, as well as offering a free survey. They'll give you information on those resources and those technologies you can implement, but they can also help with grant funding of up to 30% or £60,000. And interestingly, in the Cabinet report that's just been published, should I say, they were saying for Wiltshire, as of November, the Target 2030 hopes to aim support 100 SMEs across Swindon, Wiltshire. And so far, as of November, they've supported 44 SMEs to have a survey, and 29 have had 12 hours of support or at least £1,000 in funding, and 11 have had a grant paid out. So there's £164,000 in grants have been paid out so far. And that's saved almost 400,000 tons of carbon, which have been saved annually by these measures. And the value of the total works installed is £547,000. So you can see that small businesses, like many of you today, are taking advantage of these programmes so that they can become greener in their bid to achieve carbon neutrality. But for many of you, and Hugh's just touched on, you know, working with your partners in your supply chain, it's increasingly common during procurement processes, and the council itself are taking these steps. You know, we're looking at how our partners produce, manufacture, deliver the goods and their services. It's all very well that we are pledging to be carbon neutral, but we need to make sure that the businesses that we work with have the same aspirations. So, you know, for small businesses looking to work with larger or wider companies, it's something that's really important to aid your business growth as well. On our website, on the climate change website of Wiltshire Council, there's a number of suggestions there, you know, simple tips like changing to a green energy provider, looking at your organisation's waste, you know, how you can reduce the waste, or, you know, could you create products from the waste that you produce? You know, it's all about how we can reduce, reuse, recycle, you know, reduce our consumption, mileage, and again, touching on that responsible procurement. Any of you that's dialed into a Wiltshire Council climate webinar recently would have heard Ariane Crampton, who's our head of our climate team. You know, she uses the spheres of influence. So again, it's that sort of scope 1, 2 and 3, you know, what's within your direct control, your indirect control, and the other areas. So from a council point of view, obviously we've got a regulatory role. You know, we can lead by example. We can also support our partners in their delivery. and just sort of promote that message as wide as possible. And in addition, the council are also developing a decision aiding tool to integrate the carbon reduction and climate resilience into decision making and strategic planning. And that will be applicable across all areas of sustainability and social value. So that's a really exciting opportunity from a local authority perspective. So as I said at the beginning, I'm part of the economy and enterprise team. So I support the enterprise networks, which some of you may be aware of. You know, we provide incubation and startup space in the form of offices, small industrial units and co-working areas for new and growing businesses, in addition to a virtual mailbox service. So our spaces are designed to be economical and supportive, you know, where many small businesses are, you know, just finding their feet. And as you can see, we've got centres across Wiltshire. But as part of our operations, so there's a number of things that we have done as a service area, or that we are considering. So obviously, you know, that behaviour change in our tenants, you know, our offices are, for our office renters are available 24/7. So, you know, we have a little bit of control over that, you know, about the lights and the heating, but we are encouraging our tenants to be more aware in how they use our spaces. In terms of Port and Science Park, you know, there's a free shuttle bus which takes staff to the campus, so there's not multiple vehicles all heading in the same direction in those office hours. And obviously there is a travel plan in discussion as well, as that site is growing. You know, the building B will be opening in the summer, so there'll be more people working in that area of the county. So it's about better using the travel routes. We're also looking at the installation of solar panels on some of our buildings as part of the council's wider carbon reduction programme. And obviously through our social media platforms, we have been promoting the grants through Carbon 2030, for example, and it's good to see that there has been take up of those measures. And then there's little things, you know, again, the low hanging fruit, you know, what can we do? We can reduce our printed materials, we can try and be more responsible in the resources that we use. And as obviously as a council, that provides a saving for us as well as being environmentally friendly. So we've put together a number of resources. These are on our Enterprise Network website, but they're also on the Wiltshire Council climate pages. So you've got the UK Business Climate Hub. The Carbon Lens is another one. I don't think Hugh's mentioned that on this particular webinar, but for anyone that's dialed in previously, I think they've been mentioned. And the Southwest Manufacturing Advice Service. So again, there's lots of easily accessible services available for businesses that want to better understand what they can do, particularly if, say, you're in manufacturing. You know, it might be more applicable to speak to the Southwest Manufacturing Advice because they understand the nature of your business more readily. And it's good to see that hundreds of businesses across the UK have already made a pledge to becoming greener. And this is taken from the businessclimatehub.uk.org. And you can see there's a number across Swindon and Wiltshire already. So, you know, in the breakout rooms today, I've already heard there's some really good initiatives and some businesses who are really striving to be carbon neutral. So if you're doing your bit, you know, absolutely go on the website and register, you know, get your name on that map so we can fill those gaps, given that Salisbury Plainfields are quite a large one of them. But there's so many brilliant businesses all striving to support the environment. And the other one is, Hugh's already mentioned, you know, finding that funding. So Target 2030 is the main one that we're aware of. But again, there's money through BAYS, and a lot of that does filter down through the local enterprise partnerships. So being aware of what's available and just signing up to the BAYS newsletter will give you a bit of a nod if it's relevant to your particular area. And I've said previously, there's so much information on the Wiltshire Council's climate pages. There's the link if you want to go and take a look for yourself. And I'm happy to share these slides if Hugh wants to forward them afterwards. So thank you very much. That was me. I don't want to take up any more of your time because we are bang on 12 o'clock. So thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, Rachel. That was really interesting. Good to see the progress that's being made as well. Yeah, it's an interesting gap around Salisbury, isn't it?
Yeah, and like I said, I've had a look at the papers that are produced for Cabinet, and it's interesting. It does talk about, obviously, the Wiltshire Council's pension programme. There's so much that has happened over the last 6 months. It's worth a read. It's only about 40 pages, I think, so, but it's worth a read.
Lovely. Does anyone have any questions for Rachel? Rachel, could you put your email address in the chat, and then that way, if anyone comes up with anything afterwards, they can get in touch with you as well.
Will do. Thank you very much.
As long as you all agree not to spam her. That's all. Okay, I'm aware it's 12 o'clock. There's a little bit more of this to get through, so we'll crack on. Obviously, if you have to drop off, then that's fine. The presentation's recorded, so you can always catch up on it then. But hopefully you're going to stick it through to the end. So I will reshare my screen and get cracking. But that was really helpful. Thanks, Rachel. Okay, so where we are, yeah. So Rob from Swindon Borough Council has sent his apologies, but I'm going to share a slide deck that he's come up with as well. It's just similar to what Rachel's just gone through there, and I know he's keen to work with companies in Swindon that are taking steps to lower their carbon footprint and to sort of promote them through case studies for their Be the Change campaign. So I'll share Rob's details with you afterwards as well. But I think it seems like a good time on the back of what Rachel was talking about financing options, to just cover these off fairly quickly. So to look at the grants, the loans, and the equity financing options that are out there. And I think, as Rachel rightly said, Target 30, which is run by 7Y Energy Agency, is the primary grant at the moment in Swindon and Wiltshire to support green business initiatives. So this is going to give you, I think it's 30% of up to 30% of the funding, up to a maximum of £60,000 to install energy efficient equipment across your premises. So LED light bulbs, solar panels, heat pumps, things like that. 7Y and Target 2030 will do an energy survey, see the areas that you can be improving on, as Rachel said, and then actually give you that level of money to support that. Most of the projects don't go up to £60,000. Most of them are smaller, but that's great. They're doing well at the moment, and I think they are going to continue for a little while longer, but it will run out eventually, so it's worth thinking about that one sooner rather than later. The others, the plug-in grants cover electric vehicles, electric delivery trucks, things like that, and they are a national scheme, and it's accompanied by grants for charging points at the workplace as well. And then the other one I put on here is the Innovation for Growth grant, which offers funding for R&D projects in a particular industry that drive innovation in that sector. And this is run by UWE, so the University of West England, and is accessible at the moment, and is again focused on this region. So that's a good one to think about if you are coming up with innovative ideas to lower your carbon footprint that could be applicable to your wider sector. I won't go into too much more detail on the loans and equity financing options here, because they're fairly interchangeable. So the loans, most of your main high street banks will provide some sort of specialised SME/green lending option. I know Lloyds have a focus in this region, as do HSBC, and they've come up with a specific SME green lending scheme recently, but most of those are fairly interchangeable, so it's worth having a look at those if you want to go for a loan option. So if you want to fund a project that isn't covered by the grants, which are more specific to energy efficiency, innovation and electric vehicles, then loans could be a good option for you there. And the same with equity financing as well. I'm willing to have conversations further about any of those offline one-to-one conversations. So another question that a lot of business owners are asking themselves at the moment when it comes to improving their green credentials is what steps can they take to get certification for the headway that they're making as a green business? And it is a good question because you've made the changes, or you're considering making the changes to your company. So you want some type of recognition for what you're doing. And this is where green certification schemes and carbon reduction commitments can come into play. And environmental sustainability certification and commitment sort of allow you to market your green activity effectively. And the best ones give you a trusted stamp of approval as well for your efforts and future commitments that you're making to lower your carbon footprint. And then also commitments and certifications offer verification for your carbon reporting, which is obviously great because you don't want to be accused of marking your own homework, as we said earlier. So I'm just going to give you a bit of insight into a few of the accreditations that you can take a look at. And the first thing we're going to turn to is commitments and pledges. So with climate commitments and climate pledges, these are sort of looking to the future, if you like. They're not about what you're doing at the moment as a business, but they're about what you plan to do going forward. And the biggest one at the moment, and the one that is being most widely talked about, is the SME Climate Hub, which is a hugely popular commitment that was promoted in tandem with COP26, and I think it's got about 2,600 signatories at the moment, of which SWLEP is one actually, which is nice. So when you sign up to SME Climate Hub, you are committing to halve your emissions by 2030 and become net zero by 2050 at the latest, ideally earlier. And just the fact that these targets are set by an external organisation gives them a certain level of credibility rather than just your own business setting your targets, which might be too easy to achieve, obviously. And because of the fact they look at what you will do, this is a great first step for a company that's looking to become greener further down the line. So if we take the SME Climate Hub as an example, not only does it commit you to tying yourself into those commitments, but it's actually also got a load of really helpful resources that actually then enable you to follow through with the pledge that you're making. And we're going to hear from G from the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership in a second about some of those resources and how you can access them as well, which are really helpful as you sort of drive towards net zero. We're also going to take a look at accreditations and certifications. And so these are great for companies that are already doing green activities and want to get them certified. So unlike commitments where commitments reward concrete pledges, these reward concrete actions that you're already taking. So a good example is B Corp. So this is a rigorous procedure which looks at high levels of performance across environmental sustainability, but also social sustainability and governance sustainability as well. So it's a massive array of criteria that looks at what you're currently doing as a business. And if you pass the test at that moment in time, then you can become a B Corporation. Otherwise, unlike pledges, it doesn't tie you to what you're promising to do in the future, basically. And I think in terms of the type of commitment or pledge versus accreditation and certification, the route you choose to go down is obviously going to depend a lot of where you are as a business. I think today, most of the companies here looking to set out on a journey towards sustainability, it's probably wiser to make a commitment and a pledge at this moment in time and then gradually work towards an accreditation or certification. I mean, you can start working towards those certifications now, but it's understanding that is going to take quite a long time to reach that marker. So as I mentioned, the SME Climate Hub there, which is a great pledge you can make for your business. And one of the benefits of signing up is the resources that can help you lower your carbon footprint. And on that note, I would like to introduce Jiju from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, who is just going to talk about the resources that you can access via the CISL once you've signed up to the SME Climate Hub. So, G, would you like to share your screen once I've stopped sharing and give everyone a quick run through?
Yeah, we'll do that. Thanks, Hugh. Let me just share my slide here. Thanks everyone for sticking around. I know it has been a morning packed with knowledge, insights, and conversations, and it's getting to the lunchtime. So I will keep it short and sweet, and so it doesn't eat into everyone's lunch break. So basically, as Hugh introduced, I work at the CISL, so part of the accelerator and incubator team. So what we've done last year is we developed this free online learning courses called Climate Fit. And it was launched last year at climate conference COP26 in Glasgow. So I just want to give you a really quick overview and intro about what is Climate Fit. So this is the deck I prepared, but also give you a quick demo. So I will log into my SME Climate Hub login and give you an insider view of what actually it looks like on the website. So as Hugh mentioned, this course is co-created, between us and also BSR, which is another non-for-profit consultancy on sustainability, and it's hosted on SME Climate Hub. But it is also built with SMEs and also for SMEs. So through the whole way, we were, acutely aware that this is not going to be something that we create within the ivory tower, but detached from the reality. So we have been engaging SMEs and innovators from the very beginning, and we took on board feedback from their side. A is to make it super actionable, to really break down step by step. So that's why you will see a lot of like an action checklist through the course. And the second one is to really feature and showcase other successful SMEs, how they're doing, what you can learn from them, or maybe get inspired from their initiatives as well. So what is Climate Fit? I just realized I haven't yet really talked about that. So basically, the course provides the training on a variety of topics. It is specifically created for SMEs like you, regardless of where you are in your decarbonization journey. And it also provides very interactive and practical guidance that will help you to reduce the emission, also generate your competitive advantage, and enhance your customer appeals. So this all will be broken down into step by step. So this is basically, how it is structured. It covers 7 modules. In the next slide, I'm going to talk a bit more about those 7 modules. And each module takes about 20 to 30 minutes to finish that. We're aware SMEs are fairly busy, so we try to just to create those bite-sized modules. And then it is a highly interactive. Trust me, it won't be as boring as reading academic papers. So it is beautifully designed, and we put a lot of interactions in it just to keep SMEs engaged on the topic. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it's very concrete, it's very tangible, and also packed with a lot of case studies. So it is a combination of case studies from big corporate and also, most importantly, from SMEs. We're at the stage to try to get it translated into different language as well. So the first one is Spanish. It's almost done. It's due to launch in about 2 to 3 weeks. And our goal or our aim is to really make Climate Fit become the go-to course for any SMEs anywhere around the world, help them to start their journey. So it is something designed for beginners. And later on, we were thinking about how to create another advanced version, or probably different courses fitting to different industries and sectors. So I promised that I'm going to talk a bit about 7 modules. So it is basically covers almost all aspects of your business, starting from climate strategy and governance. Here you mentioned a bit about how you set the target, set your climate target. So here we're talking about once you have the target, what kind of strategy and governance needed to achieve that goal. And then the second one is around operation. This is more about your scope 1 emission and how can you reduce the emission within the first scope. And then also beyond the company is about how you engage suppliers along the supply chain. And then the fourth one is around design. This is might not applicable for every company, but some company, they probably are thinking, how can they design out waste from the very beginning? So they're very upstream innovation. So this is about how you bring sustainability into the upstream design at the design stage. And then the fifth one is about finance. Hugh talked about the different ways to get the ground of finance for this transition. So in this module, it covers a lot. It's mainly talk about how you create a business case that would help you to get the grant or the loan from the bank. And then the sixth one is about people and the community, because it's not going to be enough. If there's only one or a couple of employees at the company are passionate about this. So how you engage your employees at the company and also engage the community. Some of them social enterprises, they're thinking about to give back to their community as well. Last but not least is how to tell your impactful stories. So this is something we talked a bit earlier this morning about greenwashing. There is a lot of greenwashing out there. Customers, they are savvy as well. So they could tell whether this is greenwashing or it's genuinely sustainability. So how to craft your story, how to tell your customers that is what you have been doing. So this is covered in the last module. Just a quick note here. So there are 7 modules. They are loosely designed to be taken in this order, but you don't have to stick to this order at all. So one feature we were thinking was to make sure this course is very modular. So for any startup, you can just pick and choose whichever topic or whichever module works for you, and then get stuck in. So there is no need to follow the sequence of the module here. And then just a quick summarize of how the climate fit could support your business. As I mentioned, it's something we make it very easier for you to take action. Also, this is a piece of training that we believe, at this stage, a lot of SMEs probably want to get a good understanding of this complex and wicked problem. And then the third thing is, in this module, we also share and provide links to other free tools that you could use. So make it like one stop for the SMEs. For example, you might heard of science-based target. This is another free tool. So that's covered in the module as well. And then last, ultimately, is we want to support and help business to mitigate the risk and improve their resilience to make sure your business is future-proof. And then the next question is probably, yes, it is free, but how could I access to this course? So I thought it's probably easier, rather than just to talk about it on the slide, it probably would be easier if I just show you, give you a really quick whistle-stop tour on the SME climate fit. So bear with me with one moment. I'm gonna bring there you go. So if you click on that, smeclimatehub.org, this is the the cover page you will see. And if you're interested or make the commitment or pledge, just click get started. So the first thing you will see is this SME climate commitment. Hugh has covered about it, so I'm not going to say more about that. But the one thing I like to make a note here is sometimes SMEs find it a bit daunting to make the commitment before even get to know what they're actually committing. But SME Climate Hub, their commitment here is more like to provide a direction for travel. It is for the future. Those are 3 commitments you are making. And once you make this commitment, you will have the full access to every resources, tools provided on the SME Climate Hub. So, so this can be the initial hurdle, but what I wanted to say is don't let this commitment put you off. Sign it up and give it a try. So once you feeling, once there is, because I've already signed it up, but once you fill in some information here, and it will bring you to your own user dashboard. So I'm just gonna log into my dashboard. So each business, you will have your own dashboard, and this dashboard covers what is your profile and all the tools. Some have already been developed. For example, this is about Measure. This program is sponsored by Google and working together with Normative. And if you scroll down, you will see education. So this is the Climate Fit. And you click on the education, and that is basically the Climate Fit course. So all the 7 modules are covered here on the front page. As I mentioned, you can just pick whichever modules most interested to you and get stuck in. So quick demo, maybe I just try operation. I think this is probably the topic that relevant to everyone here. We all got thinking about the operations. So the left-hand side is the outline of those modules. It includes introduction and also breakdown of the 7 different topics here. So for example, it covers how to increase the energy efficiency, how to introduce renewable energies, how to manage the fleet emissions, how you deal with business travels, etc., and also waste as well. We talked about recycling this morning. So each of the module started with a fun bit. This is what we worked with the eco-athletes. They are eco-athletes, but they were Olympians, Para-Olympians. Now they're retired, they're getting interested into the sustainability. So they will be like your coach and coaching you along the way. So every beginning of the module, you will hear from them how they draw the analogy between, as a sports person, getting trained up for their Olympic Games versus as an SME, how to reach to that net zero target. So this is the fun bit. And we think people would love to hear the different story, but also relevant to their own journey. And every session there is a wrap up which includes the summary of the lesson and the checklist. You can download it, and then there is also downloadable roadmaps that you can kind of doing on your own. And then if you really be nerdy and want to get stuck into, those are other academic papers or resources that we referenced to. So that is where you can have a look. So end of each module, we will prompt you to the next module. For example, after the operation, that is the supply chain, you can go to the supply chain, or you can just go back to the introduction, which will bring you back to this front cover page. So this is a very, very quick whistle-stop tour of the Climate Fit. I have another, just 2 slides. Please bear with me. I go back to my slides here. Oh, so some quick questions. I think people asked many times, but of course, if it doesn't cover your question, feel free to send me an email or drop a note in the chat box. So it is free of charge. And then this is access on SME Climate Hub. And the process can be tracked. if you sign it up as a company, this account or this learning material could be shared with your employees as well. And people ask about whether they could get a certificate. We're working on that. University of Cambridge is a bit restricted in terms of giving certificate, but we're working with SME Climate Hub and want to understand that maybe we can give a completion certificate from SME Climate Hub. And then the last one is large corporate. This is probably less relevant with today's audience. So here is my email address. It's just the j.zhou@cisl.cam.ac.uk. Last bit I want to talk about is at CISL, we provide those training materials, but we also work with business through our accelerator program. We have our own incubator, which is due to open this April, which is based right in the center of Cambridge. And we receive fundings from philanthropic groups, from the European grant, that we could provide all the service or all the help to the SMEs free of charge. If you are interested into any of that, please feel free to get in touch. Yeah, that's all from my side. And welcome any questions, criticism, anything. Thanks all.
Simon.
Oh, Simon.
Well, you're on mute, Simon.
Yes, Jia, is that how you pronounce your name?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah. It would be very nice to have a certificate from the University of Cambridge, but are there any other organizations that can offer certification at, I mean, with a small business, the external accreditation at several £1,000s upwards is probably not something that we would do. Are there any external organizations that can offer some sort of proof of our attempts to do this?
Yeah, there are. Hugh actually mentioned, for example, like a B Corp. So again, but this is you probably got to pay to get that certificate. And then for SME Climate Hub, if you sign it up, you can put that SME Climate Hub logo on your website. So that is another way. And then if you receive fundings from, for example, or grant, Innovate UK, or low carbon, I know low carbon Cambridgeshire or low carbon Peterborough. So you're more than welcome to stick their logo on your website as well. So because this is a free of charge course, I don't think University of Cambridge would be willing to do that. But there are postgraduates or there are online courses, so you might be able to get a certificate from that.
Great, thank you, Jia.
No, you're welcome. And also Oxford University is the knowledge shape partner of SME Climate Hub. So there is a bunch of resources created by them on the SME Climate Hub as well. So just have a look. I think it's super helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Almost as helpful as Hugh is doing here.
So B Corp, you said B Corp. That's an easy access, low cost option you mentioned. How do you spell that? You mentioned earlier on they were talking about B Corp.
Yeah. So B for boy and corporation, just CORP. B Corp.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Lovely. Daniel, you look like you're ready to talk as well.
Yeah. Just one. There's only one question. Have you got any, have you got any success stories or examples you could just talk to us about some of the SMEs that have worked with you or worked with you with regards to the other sides of the organisations that you work with?
Yeah. So the successful story is like we worked quite a lot with university spin-offs. They're PhD students and they would love to commercialize their R&D. And then we work with them and we bring in Cambridge Enterprise, which is the arm of the university to commercialize these great ideas. And also we work with Cambridge Innovation Capital. That is the VC that brings in the money into the business. So most of the, we worked with a lot of them actually startup, less so with SMEs. So for those startup, what they find genuinely helpful and useful from working with us is A, the network. So we really open the whole Cambridge network to them. B is the potential to get funding. So it's interesting, a lot of startups, graduated from our accelerator, they managed to secure funding very easily. And yeah, and then third is the mentorship. So we know some of them areas are quite technical, so we might not have this in-house expertise, and then we would bring in the industrial expert to put them in touch and be able to provide one-to-one mentorship. So those are the things. Successful example is when Boris Johnson got married last year, his wife actually rent her wedding dress, and that wedding dress, the company who do the wedding dress rental graduated from our accelerator program. I don't know whether that's I don't know whether that's a successful story or not, given what's happening with Boris Johnson. I probably should stop using that.
Keep it non-political. Brilliant, thank you, Jude.
Lovely. As long as they don't do party dresses, then we're all happy. Okay. Yeah. Any other questions for G? I think maybe if you want to email them over, that's all right. And then I'm sure she'll be more than happy to answer any questions that anyone's got. I'm just going to finish up now. I won't reshare my screen because we're at the end of the presentation. But I was just going to say before we go, I want to give a brief overview of the support that we offer as a LEP as well in terms of carbon reduction, because there are various things out there. Obviously, one-to-one session with myself is fully funded, so that's something you can access to talk about exactly what your business is up to. But something that we've done recently, and that's why I think he's just had to drop off the call, and Rachel mentioned him earlier as the business, is partner with a company called Carbon Lens to help 20 organisations in Swindon and Wiltshire measure their scope 1 and 2 emissions. So basically, Richard from Carbon Lens is a sustainability consultant, and through funding from the LEP, he will work with your organisation to give you that initial picture of exactly what your scope 1 and 2 emissions are. And we're just trying to overcome the obstacle of one of the hardest things to do when you're starting out is measuring. So we're trying to facilitate the start of that process by working with Richard. So I think it's worth noting on this call that that's something you'd be interested in taking advantage of understanding that initial scope 1 and 2 measurement of your carbon footprint, then please reach out to me and I'd be more than happy to introduce you to Richard to help sort that out. We are also looking into scope 3 support with him as well, which will be for slightly fewer businesses, because scope 3, as we've found out, is a different beast to scopes 1 and 2. And this is going to be more of an educational piece, so helping you understand where your scope 3 emissions are going to be coming from and giving you the tools to measure that going forward, sort of a teach a man to fish sort of scenario, so that down the line you can build out your own understanding of exactly what your scope 3 emissions are as well. And that will be also funded by the LEP. So each of those will cover 3 hours worth of support with Richard. So again, if you are interested in taking advantage of that, then please feel free to reach out to myself and I can broker that introduction. But I think that is it in terms of the content that we wanted to cover off today. I'm sorry for overrunning. My timekeeping is absolutely dreadful. But thank you very much for sticking it out to the end with me. I'm happy to stay on here until I've answered everyone's questions. But other than that, thanks all very much for coming along and sticking it out to the end. It's been good to talk with you and hear your thoughts. So yeah, if you've got any questions for me, I'll take them now. But if not, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week.